a WikiVidi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Salem Witch Trials. The Salem Witch Trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693. More than 200 people were accused, 19 of whom were found guilty and executed by hanging. One other man was pressed to death for refusing to plead, and at least 5 people died in jail. It was the deadliest witch hunt in the history of the United States. 12 other women had previously been executed in Massachusetts and Connecticut during the 17th century. Despite being generally known as the Salem Witch Trials, the preliminary hearings in 1692 were conducted in several towns: Salem Village, Salem Town, Ipswich, and Andover. The most infamous trials were conducted by the Court of Oyer and Terminer in 1692 in Salem Town. The episode is one of Colonial America's most notorious cases of mass hysteria. It has been used in political rhetoric and popular literature as a vivid cautionary tale about the dangers of isolationism, religious extremism, false accusations, and lapses in due process. It was not unique, but a colonial American example of the much broader phenomenon of witch trials in the early modern period, which took place also in Europe. Many historians consider the lasting effects of the trials to have been highly influential in subsequent United States history. According to historian George Lincoln Burr, the Salem witchcraft was the rock on which the theocracy shattered. At the 300th anniversary events in 1992 to commemorate the victims of the trials, a park was dedicated in Salem and a memorial in Danvers. In November 2001, an act passed by the Massachusetts legislature exonerated 5 people, while another one, passed in 1957, had previously exonerated 6 other victims. As of 2004, there was still talk about exonerating all the victims, though something that happened in the 19th century as the Massachusetts colonial legislature was asked to reverse the attainders of George Burroughs and others. In January 2016, the University of Virginia announced its Gallows Hill project team had determined the execution site in Salem, where the 19 witches had been hanged. The city owns the site and is planning to establish a memorial to the victims. Background: whilst witch trials had begun to fade out across much of Europe by the mid-17th century, they continued on the fringes of Europe and in the American colonies. The events in 1692–1693 in Salem became a brief outburst of a sort of hysteria in a new world, while the practice was already waning in most of Europe. In Against Modern Sadducism, Joseph Glanville claimed that he could prove the existence of witches and ghosts of the supernatural realm. Glanville wrote about the denial of the bodily resurrection and the supernatural spirits in his treatise. Glanville claimed that ingenious men should believe in witches and apparitions. If they doubted the reality of spirits, they not only denied demons, but also the Almighty God. Glanville wanted to prove that the supernatural could not be denied. Those who did deny apparitions were considered heretics, for it also disproved their beliefs in angels. Works by men such as Glanville and Cotton Mather tried to prove that demons were alive. Recorded witchcraft executions in New England. The earliest recorded witchcraft execution was that of Alce Young in 1647 in Hartford, Connecticut. Historian Clarence F. Jewett included a list of other people executed in New England in the Memorial History of Boston, including Suffolk County, Massachusetts 1630-1880. Political context: New England had been settled by religious refugees seeking to build a pure, Bible-based society. They lived closely with the sense of the supernatural. The original 1629 Royal Charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was vacated in 1684, after which King James II installed Sir Edmund Andros as the governor of the Dominion of New England. Andros was ousted in 1689 after the Glorious Revolution in England replaced the Catholic James II with the Protestant co-rulers William and Mary, Simon Bradstreet and Thomas Danforth. The colony's last leaders under the old charter resumed their posts as governor and deputy governor, but lacked constitutional authority to rule, because the old charter had been vacated. At the same time, tensions erupted between English colonists settling in the eastward and French-supported Wabanaki Indians of that territory in what came to be known as King William's War. This was 13 years after the devastating King Philip's War with the Wampanoag and other indigenous tribes in southern and western New England. In October 1690, Sir William Phips led an unsuccessful attack on French-held Quebec. Between 1689 and 1692, Native Americans continued to attack many English settlements along the Maine coast, leading to the abandonment of some of the settlements, and resulting in a flood of refugees into areas like Essex County. A new charter for the enlarged province of Massachusetts Bay was given final approval in England on October 16, 1691. News of the appointment of Phips as the new governor reached Boston in late January, and a copy of the new charter reached Boston on February 8, 1692. Phips arrived in Boston on May 14 and was sworn in as governor 2 days later, along with Lieutenant Governor William Staunton. One of the first orders of business for the new governor and council on May 27, 1692, was the formal nomination of county justices of the peace, sheriffs, and the commission of a special court of Oyer and Terminer to handle the large numbers of people who were thronging the jails. Paul Oyer and Stephen Nissenbaum have postulated that without a valid charter, the colony had no legitimate form of government to try capital cases until Phips arrived with the new charter. This has been disputed by David Koenig. He points out that between charters, according to the records of the Court of Assistants, the colony tried and condemned a group of 14 pirates on January 27, 1690, for acts of piracy and murder committed in August and October 1689. Local context. Salem Village was known for its fractious population, who had many internal disputes, and for disputes between the village and Salem Town. Arguments about property lines, grazing rights, and church privileges were rife, and neighbors considered the population as quarrelsome. In 1672, the villagers had voted to hire a minister of their own, apart from Salem Town. The first two ministers, James Bailey and George Burroughs, stayed only a few years each, departing after the congregation failed to pay their full rate. Despite the ministers' rights being upheld by the general court and the parish being admonished, each of the two ministers still chose to leave. The third minister, Deodar Lawson, stayed for a short time, leaving after the church in Salem refused to ordain him, and therefore not over issues with the congregation. The parish disagreed about Salem Village's choice of Samuel Parris as its first ordained minister. On June 18, 1689, the villagers agreed to hire Parris for £66 annually, 1/3 part in money, and the other 2/3 parts in provisions and use of the parsonage. On October 10, 1689, however, they raised his benefits, voting to grant him the deed to the parsonage and 2 acres of land. This conflicted with a 1681 village resolution which stated that it shall not be lawful for the inhabitants of this village to convey the houses or lands, or any other concerns belonging to the ministry to any particular persons or person, not for any cause by vote or other ways, though the prior minister's fates and the level of contention in Salem Village were valid reasons for caution in accepting the position. Reverend Parris increased the village's divisions by delaying his acceptance. He did not seem able to settle his new parishioners' disputes by deliberately seeking out iniquitous behavior in his congregation and making church members in good standing suffer public penance for small infractions. He contributed significantly to the tension within the village. Its bickering increased, unabated. Historian Marion Starkey suggests that, in this atmosphere, serious conflict may have been inevitable. Religious context. Prior to the constitutional turmoil of the 1680s, Massachusetts government had been dominated by conservative Puritan secular leaders, influenced by Calvinism. Puritans had opposed many of the traditions of the Church of England, including use of the Book of Common Prayer, the use of clergy vestments during services, the use of sign of the cross at baptism, and kneeling to receive communion, all of which they believed constituted popery. King Charles I was hostile to this viewpoint, and Anglican church officials tried to repress these dissenting views during the 1620s and 1630s. Some Puritans and other religious minorities had sought refuge in the Netherlands, but ultimately many made a major migration to colonial North America to establish their own society. These immigrants, who were mostly constituted of families, established several of the earliest colonies in New England, of which the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the largest and most economically important. They intended to build a society based on their religious beliefs. Colonial leaders were elected by the freemen of the colony, those individuals who had had their religious experiences formally examined and had been admitted to one of the colony's Puritan congregations. The colonial leadership were prominent members of their congregations, and regularly consulted with the local ministers on issues facing the colony. In the early 1640s, England erupted in civil war. The Puritan-dominated parliamentarians emerged victorious, and the crown was supplanted by the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell in 1653. Its failure led to restoration of the old order under Charles II. Emigration to New England slowed significantly in these years. In Massachusetts, a successful merchant class began to develop that was less religiously motivated than the colony's early settlers. Local rumors of witchcraft. Prior to 1692, there had been rumors of witchcraft in villages neighboring Salem Village and other towns. Cotton Mather, a minister of Boston's North Church, was a prolific publisher of pamphlets, including some that expressed his belief in witchcraft. In his book Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions, Mather describes his oracular observations, and how stupendous witchcraft had affected the children of Boston mason John Goodwin. Mather illustrates how the Goodwins' eldest child had been tempted by the devil and stolen linen from the washerwoman Goody Glover. Glover, of Irish Catholic descent, was characterized as a disagreeable old woman and described by her husband as a witch. This may have been why she was accused of casting spells on the Goodwin children. After the event, 4 out of 6 Goodwin children began to have strange fits, or what some people referred to as the disease of astonishment. The manifestations attributed to the disease quickly became associated with witchcraft. Symptoms included neck and back pains, tongues being drawn from their throats, and loud random outcries. Other symptoms included having no control over their bodies, such as becoming limber, flapping their arms like birds, or trying to harm others as well as themselves. These symptoms would fuel the craze of 1692. Initial events. In Salem Village, in February 1692, Betty Parris, age 9, and her cousin Abigail Williams, age 11, the daughter and niece, respectively, of Reverend Samuel Parris, began to have fits described as beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural disease to effect, by John Hale, the minister of the nearby town of Beverly. The girls screamed, threw things about the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions, according to the eyewitness account of Reverend Deodar Lawson, a former minister in Salem Village. The girls complained of being pinched and pricked with pins. A doctor, historically assumed to be William Griggs, could find no physical evidence of any ailment. Other young women in the village began to exhibit similar behaviors. When Lawson preached as a guest in the Salem Village meeting house, he was interrupted several times by outbursts of the afflicted. The first 3 people accused and arrested for allegedly afflicting Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. and Elizabeth Hubbard, were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, with Tituba being the first. Some historians believe that the accusation by Ann Putnam Jr. suggests that a family feud may have been a major cause of the witch trials. At the time, a vicious rivalry was underway between the Putnam and Porter families, one which deeply polarized the people of Salem. Citizens would often have heated debates, which escalated into full-fledged fighting. based solely on their opinion of the feud. Good was a homeless beggar, known to seek food and shelter from neighbors. She was accused of witchcraft because of her appalling reputation. At her trial, she was accused of rejecting Puritan ideals of self-control and discipline when she chose to torment and scorn children, instead of leading them towards the path of salvation. Sarah Osborne rarely attended church meetings. She was accused of witchcraft because the Puritans believed that Osborne had her own self-interests in mind following her remarriage to an indentured servant. The citizens of the town disapproved of her trying to control her son's inheritance from her previous marriage. Tituba, a South American Indian slave by way of the West Indies, likely became a target because of their ethnic differences from most of the other villagers. She was accused of attracting girls like Abigail Williams and Betty Paris with stories of enchantment from Malleus Maleficorum. These tales about sexual encounters with demons, swaying the minds of men, and fortune-telling were said to stimulate the imaginations of girls and made Tituba an obvious target of accusations. Each of these women was a kind of outcast and exhibited many of the character traits typical of the usual suspects for witchcraft accusations. They were left to defend themselves. Brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft, they were interrogated for several days, starting on March 1, 1692, then sent to jail. In March, others were accused of witchcraft: Martha Corey, child Dorothy Good, and Rebecca Nurse in Salem Village, and Rachel Clinton in nearby Ipswich. Martha Corey had expressed skepticism about the credibility of the girls' accusations and thus drawn attention. The charges against her and Rebecca Nurse deeply troubled the community, because Martha Corey was a full covenanted member of the church in Salem Village, as was Rebecca Nurse in the church in Salem Town. If such upstanding people could be witches, the townspeople thought, then anybody could be a witch, and church membership was no protection from accusation. Dorothy Good, the daughter of Sarah Good, was only 4 years old, but not exempted from questioning by the magistrates. Her answers were construed as a confession that implicated her mother. In Ipswich, Rachel Clinton was arrested for witchcraft at the end of March on independent charges unrelated to the afflictions of the girls in Salem Village. Accusations and examinations before local magistrates. When Sarah Cloyce and Elizabeth Proctor were arrested in April, they were brought before John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin at a meeting in Salem Town. The men were both local magistrates and also members of the Governor's Council. Present for the examination were Deputy Governor Thomas Danforth and assistants Samuel Sewell, Samuel Appleton, James Russell, and Isaac Addington. Objections by Elizabeth's husband, John Proctor, during the proceedings resulted in his arrest that day. Within a week, Giles Corey, Abigail Hobbs, Bridget Bishop, Mary Warren, and Deliverance Hobbs were arrested and examined. Abigail Hobbs, Mary Warren, and Deliverance Hobbs all confessed and began naming additional people as accomplices. More arrests followed: Sarah Wilds, William Hobbs, Nehemiah Abbott Jr., Mary Eastie, Edward Bishop Jr. and his wife Sarah Bishop, and Mary English. On April 30, the Reverend George Burroughs, Lydia Dustin, Susanna Martin, Dorcas Hoare, Sarah Morey and Philip English were arrested. Nehemiah Abbott Jr. was released, because the accusers agreed he was not the person whose spectre had afflicted them. Mary Eastie was released for a few days after her initial arrest, because the accusers failed to confirm that it was she who had afflicted them. She had been arrested again when the accusers reconsidered. In May, accusations continued to pour in, but some of those suspects began to evade apprehension. Multiple warrants were issued before John Willard and Elizabeth Colson were apprehended. George Jacobs Jr. and Daniel Andrews were not caught until this point. All the proceedings were investigative, but on May 27, 1692, William Phipps ordered the establishment of a special court of Oyer and Terminer for Suffolk, Essex, and Middlesex counties to prosecute the cases of those in jail. Warrants were issued for more people. Sarah Osborne, one of the first 3 persons accused, died in jail on May 10, 1692. Warrants were issued for 36 more people, with examinations continuing to take place in Salem Village. Sarah Dustin, Ann Sears, Beth Oyer Carter Sr. and her daughter Beth Oyer Carter Jr., George Jacobs, Sr. and his granddaughter Margaret Jacobs, John Willard, Alice Parker, Ann Pediator, Abigail Soames, George Jacobs Jr., Daniel Andrew, Rebecca Jacobs, Sarah Buckley and her daughter Mary Witheridge. Also included were Elizabeth Colson, Elizabeth Hart, Thomas Farrar, Sr., Roger Toothaker, Sarah Proctor, Sarah Bassett, Susanna Roots, Mary DeRich, Sarah Pease, Elizabeth Carey, Martha Carrier, Elizabeth Fosdick, Wilmot Red, Sarah Rice, Elizabeth Howe, Captain John Alden, William Proctor, John Flood, Mary Toothaker and her daughter Margaret Toothaker, and Arthur Abbott. When the Court of Oyer and Terminer convened at the end of May, the total number of people in custody was 62. Cotton Mather wrote to one of the judges, John Richards, a member of his congregation, on May 31, 1692, expressing his support of the prosecutions, but cautioning him, "Do not lay more stress on pure spectral evidence than it will bear. It is very certain that the devils have sometimes represented the shapes of persons not only innocent, but also very virtuous. Though I believe that the just God then ordinarily provides a way for the speedy vindication of the persons thus abused." Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like